Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I'm here with the most anticipated video of 2018, custom card review number 6, and this time around, we're going to be looking at some custom weapons submitted by the RegisKillbin community. So let's go ahead and jump into my 10 favorite custom weapons that you guys sent me. So up first here, we have the Haunted Arsenal from Faroon. This would be a 3-mana 2/2 legendary rogue weapon, and it just has the coolest fantasy ever. It reads, start a game if your deck has no minions. Your weapons gain +2/+2 and can be played as minions. So there's this idea that you've breathed this ghostly life into your weapons for some reason or another, and they can be played out there as living beings as opposed to merely being equipped onto your character. And they're a haunted arsenal, and I think that's really, really cool. And not only cool from a fantasy standpoint, but mechanically as well. There's a lot of neat things that can happen here. So take any given rogue weapon that's in the game right now and turn it into a minion, and then think about how good that is, particularly if it has +2/+2 in additional stats. So Kingsbane, for instance, suddenly becomes a 3/5 for 1 mana. And I think you also have to presume that the effect or the text on the card would remain as well. With something like Kingsbane, that would work fine. Any buffs, say a Cold Blood that you apply to the minion, would remain on there after it dies. It'd be shuffled into your deck, and you could draw another 1 mana 3/5 with a perhaps 4 damage Cold Blood attached. So it'd be a 1 mana 7/5 minion. That's pretty bonkers. Think about something like Assassin's Blade. It's probably not nearly as exciting, right? Because then you just have a 5/6 minion for 5 mana. Not quite so good, so maybe you don't run that one. But, you know, there's a lot of different rogue weapons. It would open up some really cool design space for ones we've never even seen before as well. And I think the compromise here is really neat. So you're sacrificing a lot not being able to run minions. So can you run enough weapons to make up the difference? Can they be enough for your minion pool in any given deck? So for me, this one just really hits all the high notes. This is a fantastically designed card. So up next here, we have Felo'Melorn from A Mage Old as Dirt. And this one's pretty wild. So let's talk about how this works exactly. This is a 10 mana weapon. It's an 8/2, which is just a ridiculously high attack for a weapon. That's crazy. 16 total damage bundled into this thing. And its battle cry reads, merge 2 minions in your hand. And what does merge 2 minions in your hand mean? Well, I think that's open for interpretation, but for me, it would operate exactly like what we've seen with zombies in the past, where you just take 2 things, you fuse them together, their costs get added up, their stats get added up, and it would have both card effects, essentially, of any given 2 minions that were added together. Now, what that means is if you have minions in your hand that are too high of a cost, say you have a 6 mana minion and an 8 mana minion, that would create a 14 mana minion, which would be traditionally unplayable. So Felo'Melorn is cool in a lot of ways, combining some really neat stuff, but in other ways it could be punished if you don't have the right things in your hand, if you played at the wrong time. So you'd have to build a deck in a way to really support this card. But if you do, you can do some really crazy cool stuff. Say Stone Tusk Boar plus Frothing Berserker, for instance. That's super scary combo where you could create some just a ridiculous, crazy board state where you have a lot of minions out there. You whirlwind with everything, and you have a charging Frothing Berserker, almost like we've seen in the past with, you know, Grim Patron Arrow Warrior. That's spooky, but you know what? That existed in the game before. It wasn't crazy overpowered, and frankly, there would be so much difficulty in achieving that because it would be 2 random minions in your hand. You'd have to have the exact right hand. You'd have to play out the right cards. I think that's a combo that would be achievable. Now, the 8 attack weapon here might be problematic in and of itself because that combined with some sort of charge damage combo is just a really impressive option, but it takes a couple turns to unfold, right? So with Felo'Melorn, you know, you play it, it's 10 mana, you don't have anything else to do, so you got a turn or 2. Can 8 damage really make a difference on its own in any given turn? I don't think so. That's really a pretty slow card for 10 mana. So there's some downside to playing this, there's some risk, or at least some challenge in achieving an exact combo that you're looking for. Other times it could backfire. So to me, although there is a lot of really absurd upside and potential for a card like this, I think the reality of it and the execution requirements keep it in check. But from a fantasy and theme flavor standpoint, Felo'Melorn hits it because that's the 2 halves of Varian Rin's weapons combined together into Felo'Melorn. So it's exactly what a minion would do. So I think it's a neat idea. And although I'm sure you could tweak the numbers a little bit here and there, again, not a final design sort of video. This is about initial design. Maybe it's a 6/2 instead, if that makes you feel better. Maybe the battle cry is a death rattle instead. regardless of whatever you think will make this the perfectly balanced card, I think it's a fantastic design either way. So up next, we're going from something really complex to something much more simple, but I love how elegantly simple this card is. This is the Spellbound Ring, and it was created by someone who I guess doesn't have a name, so they just took the phrase created by and put it backwards, as you'll see there, colon YB Detarsi. We'll call it Detarsi perhaps. But this would be a weapon for both Shaman and Mage, so it's a dual class weapon, which I don't know if that's necessary, but I'm fine with it. We've had tri-class stuff before. Perhaps we could have some dual class things in the future. And this is a 3 mana 0/3 with simply spell damage +2. And you might say, man, Regis, that's kind of boring for a custom card. And I agree, it's a little boring. But that's what I like, because this just feels like one of those starter items in any random RPG, particularly World of Warcraft, like some just green item you get like while at level 5 or something. So perhaps this should have been a common quality instead of an epic. That's irrelevant. It matches, it's purple, it's nice. I'm okay with it either way. But it just feels like that, you know, basic starting RPG item. And I really like that aspect of it. Not to mention spell damage, of course, very empowering in both of these classes we've seen in the past. Shaman and Mage can both use spell damage very successfully. Now, this is, you know, a permanent spell damage in a way, which might seem scary to people at first glance. Like, man, imagine how good Mage would be if they always had 2 spell damage. But remember, as is the case with all of these weapons, weapon removal out there exists. So it's never something that's truly permanent. And beyond that, if you compare this to something like Cosmic Anomaly, for instance, this doesn't have nearly as much of an immediate impact as a card like Cosmic Anomaly, because that 4/3 body lingers out there and can create tons of pressure and take trades, requires more distinct and targeted removal from your opponent. Spellbound Ring just kind of floats. So the 2 mana has to take a while to really spin up in value, unlike something like Cosmic Anomaly. So you're really investing this 3 mana into the future. So I think it'd be playable. There are certainly kinds of decks that would work with this. Might even have some positive synergies with something like Alaneth. Or if you get stuck with an Alaneth, you could use this to break your Alaneth and then make some crazy turns with Arcane Missiles and Cinderstorms and so on and so forth. So I don't want to judge this card if you think it would make Mage overpowered. That's not a reason to say that it's a bad card. That may be a problem with Mage at a fundamental level, but I like this design. I think it looks like a very real sort of Hearthstone card, the kind of thing that Blizzard would absolutely put into the game, and I think it would be a neat inclusion. So whoever you are out there, Detarsi, thanks for submitting this pretty intriguing little card. Moving on, up next we have the Affliction Scythe from All Skulls. This would be a Warlock weapon, a 1 mana 0/2 that reads, the attack is always equal to the total damage your hero has taken for the turn. So this is the perfect Warlock synergy weapon. When you're doing damage to your hero, this thing gets better and better. So it's like a Nether Soul Buster in a way, but it's a weapon, and that attack value lasts in each individual turn. And there's a couple ways I think a card like this operates. So for instance, think about it in the early game. It's often if you play, for instance, a Kobold Librarian, this would be a 1 mana 2/2 weapon, which might help you trade into your opponent's Flame Imp if you're in a Zoo matchup. And it could be utilized as this early game board removal or board trading kind of tool. And it would be very good as a 1 mana 2/2 or 1 mana 3/2 with a Flame Imp, for instance. A 1 mana Fire War Axe, that's nuts. And it is, that's pretty awesome. But the downside of the card like Affliction Scythe, or at least the balancing aspect, the thing that would keep it in check instead of being as overpowered as something like Fire War Axe for 1 mana, is the fact that you can't always really easily do damage to yourself, or often if you do, then you're spending mana to do that. So it'd be hard, for instance, to play this in the early game particularly efficiently. Yes, on turn 2, you could Flame Imp into Affliction Scythe. That would line up, but those cards aren't always in hand. Sometimes that 1 or 2 extra points of mana could get in the way of other things you want to do. So a card like this, although it could provide a lot of early tempo, could also just get stalled out where you play it and you don't find that next, self-damage piece to help you empower the weapon. Now, the other way you could use Affliction Scythe is for some kind of crazy combo in the late game where you try to do like 20 damage to yourself in a single turn and you make this a 1 mana 20 damage weapon. And I think that's particularly exciting. I don't know what that would look like, but with cards like Blood Bloom, those sorts of things are possible. So maybe you build a deck that doesn't take any damage and then you play Affliction Scythe and you try to take a ton of damage all at once and then you hit your opponent for like 20 or 30. Probably not 30 because that'd be really hard, but maybe 29. And I think that would be fantastic to see. So I like that this operates in two ways, and I think that's really cool for a card to be maybe an early game card, maybe a late game combo card. In both cases, I think it would be good, or at least intriguing and interesting, maybe not necessarily super competitive. It may not ever define a deck if it were ever real. It's not going to be, of course, but the cards like that have that dual aspect, that flexibility, that's good design. If it works for the class so well that it can work in a couple different directions, I think that means you did something right. So all skulls, I really like the design here for Affliction Scythe. And then up next, we have the Flame Forged Axe from XYZ Inferno. This is a shaman weapon this time around. 4 mana, 3/1. So right off the bat, the stat line doesn't sound great for a 4 mana weapon, but I really like this death rattle. If you played an elemental last turn, equip this again. So the idea here, good flavor, this axe is being forged from fire. If you played an elemental, those elemental energies lingering around from last turn are helping you, capture the elemental energy and forge it into a new weapon. And that's a really neat idea. And it also, of course, plays on this elemental synergy we've seen in the past, where if you play an elemental last turn, you get to do something cool. But unlike with other cards where it's often playing it from your hand with elemental synergies, this one's a little bit more up in the air as far as how well you can achieve this effect. So for instance, this only has 1 charge. So if you want to use it, you can play it this turn. Say you play an elemental on 3, you play your Flame Forged Axe on 4, you're fine to attack, right? But it comes back on turn 5 because it activated the death rattle. But then if you attack on turn 5, you didn't get to play an elemental on turn 4 because you only played your Flame Forged Axe. So then do you have to hold on to it? Do you play an elemental on 5, and then you get to attack on 6? And there's always that kind of second turn where this might be awkward or might be hard. Later in the game, of course, you can slot in some flame elementals and stuff to make it easily more achievable. But if you're trying to play this on curve, especially, it could get awkward pretty fast. And, there are other times elemental decks might just run dry, too, where they didn't have an elemental last turn. So you're kind of stuck with this weapon that doesn't really do anything. So yes, occasionally this could be a 3/7. Sometimes it's going to be a 3/1, though, that doesn't feel very good. Also, you're putting some neat interactions in place with weapon removal on your opponent's side of things. Like, do they decide to remove this when you have not played an elemental last turn? They can wait and say, oh, he didn't play an elemental last turn. This is my chance to get rid of this thing. So it, in a way, plays around weapon removal, or at the very least, forces your opponent to think about it and make more strategic decisions. And often you could even counterplay that right back if you're expecting weapon removal too. So all told, I think this card creates some neat back and forth between the opponent and you. It's very fitting for Shaman as a class, and flavor-wise, it makes a lot of sense as well. And I think it would be a strong card, probably not crazy overpowered in my mind, but a good one nonetheless. So I'm curious what everybody else thinks about how this one lands on a balance standpoint. But again, this is an initial design video. I really like how this one turns out from an initial design standpoint. Moving on here, we have Puppet on a Stick from Red Stake, a 5-mana 0/0 Warlock weapon, 0/0. That doesn't sound very good, but its battlecry reads, discard a random minion and gain its stats. So we have a discard synergy card for Warlock. Previously we had a self-damage one. This one's all about discarding. And then the death rattle reads, summon the discarded minion. And again, this one absolutely nails it from a fantasy standpoint. You're losing this minion, but the weapon becomes this, sort of voodoo doll or recreation of that minion. And then when that minion dies, perhaps its soul energy or something is, transferred by the Warlock and summoned onto the board as that given minion. But the real upside here is that it takes discard something that's bad and potentially turns it into something really, really good. And that's fantastic because Warlock right now with discard, it's hard to make discard work. Blizzard has tried time and time again, and this card might be the first one that could actually do it. Because think about some of these situations. For instance, if you discarded a Doomguard, this would be a 5/7 weapon. And a 5/7 for 5 mana puts Arcanite Reaper to shame in a big way. Of course, though, actually hitting Doomguard might be rather difficult to do because you got to have only a Doomguard in your hand. Other times this might just be a Kobold Librarian, and that certainly wouldn't be the sort of thing you're looking for 5 mana. So much like we saw with Charlemagne previously, you have to create hand states where this thing makes sense. Void Lords would be pretty good too. A 3/9 weapon for 5 mana would honestly be fantastic. That's that Lord Jaraxxus weapon stat line almost. So what minions do you have in hand? What minions do you put in your deck? Everything all adds up there to make sense. Again, the death rattle on this means summoning a Doomguard would be fantastic if you lose your puppet on a stick, but it would take 7 turns in order to do that. Now you might say, well, the opponent has weapon removal, Regis. Of course they're going to want to destroy a 5/7. They might, but are they going to want to summon a Doom Guard in its place? You got to have a decision there. Maybe they wait till a board state where they can handle a Doom Guard. Maybe they just let the 5/7 weapon wreak havoc for a while because they just can't handle the Doom Guard. Again, it creates these neat board states and situations where decisions and friction and all this stuff adds up, and all of these difficult decisions have to be made. Now, Doom Guard, of course, I shouldn't have led with that example because everybody can say, oh my god, this card's overpowered. It's a 5/7. Even if your opponent destroys you, get a Doom Guard. That is absurd for 5 mana. It is. That's really, really good. That's what I'm saying. Like, that's the high roll opportunity. There are a lot of low rolls for this card as well. Remember that Kobold Librarian situation. Even like a Flame Imp isn't going to feel all that good. So if you're trying to run like a hyper aggressive Zoo deck, how often are you going to get that exact Doom Guard board state? Maybe not all that often, right? So I think that, again, there are checks and balances on the power level here. There are some really difficult ways to make this thing work, and discard can still be punishing. You know, if your opponent doesn't remove this thing, you might just get stuck attacking Giggling Inventors for 4 turns with your puppet on a stick, and you really didn't do anything even if it was a 5/7. So if I was going to try to balance this card just a little bit, again, I'm not super worried about balance, but if I was going to tweak it a little, just pull it back, I might write something like discard a random card, and if it's a minion, gain its stats. That way you could still discard things like Gul'dan or spells, and you'd have some really terrible downside to keep it even more in check. So you'd have to balance your deck even more focused into this, because otherwise it might be just a tad too easy. I don't know. We'd have to see it in action, but again, maybe make it 6 mana, 7 mana. Who cares? I like the fantasy. I like the design. I think it's a good fit for the mechanics of Warlock. So even if it's not absolutely perfect or maybe a little overpowered, I still think it's a good card. Up next here, we have the Boomsday Bomb from Blue Zombie Blood, and this would be a weapon for Hunter, and it's finally a much-needed control tool for Hunter. An 8-mana 1/1 weapon that reads, after your hero attacks, destroy all minions. So it's essentially a Twisting Nether attached to a weapon attack. And you might say, well, Regis, that's just kind of boring. That's Twisting Nether. But it's not. I think there's a couple very neat interactions that this card creates. So for instance, you have to attack to activate this effect. And sometimes if your opponent has, say, a Lich King on board, you're not really going to want to attack into that taunt and take 8 damage just in order to remove the Lich King. So there's immediately this bigger downside than you'd see with Twisting Nether, because that could be particularly problematic with any big taunt. Hooked Reaver, same story. All these boards with big taunts that you want to kill, it's risky to do so. You might just, have to bite the bullet and take the hit, but there's punishment there. Another interesting aspect of this card is that you can bank your Twisting Nether. If you're somehow playing this magical control Hunter list that doesn't currently probably exist, but would with a card like this perhaps, then if you have 8 spare mana laying around, like if your opponent just took a slow turn, you got some time, you could take the Boomsday Bomb, play it, and wait to use it on a future turn if you're confident your opponent doesn't have any weapon removal, or even if they do have weapon removal, maybe they don't have a great time to use it because they have minions on board, or they just, don't want to lose their weapon removal. They don't want to lose their ooze. Like that 3/2 is really valuable, right? But you can bank the value, so you can spend the mana now and use it later. You can't always do that with something like Twisting Nether. So you could clear the board, play this, wait a couple turns, clear the board, and then drop your own Lich King or drop a big board. So it creates a much bigger swing opportunity than something like Twisting Nether can allow when you only have 2 spare mana that same turn. It's hard for Warlock to really make a big flip. So those rare situations where that's possible, Boomsday Bomb is a lot better. Other times it can be a lot worse. And I think that's what makes it neat. Also just giving Hunter a more board clear card, a true removal, wide removal, total removal card for Hunter is something I've never really seen. It's always like, oh, Crushing Walls. Okay, that's kind of okay, but pretty terrible most of the time. This would fix that a little bit. Maybe we could play that slow Hunter. Perhaps this wouldn't need to exist in the same meta as Rexar, because that might make slow Hunter way too good. But with Rexar rotating out before too long, a card like Boomsday Bomb could fill that slot nicely and allow people to play the slow Hunter we've always dreamed of. So up next here, we have Gravitron from Meat and Explosions, a warrior weapon, a 7 mana 1/3. And this is another one I think we can compare to a removal card of old, But with Gravitron, instead of, Twisting Nether, this time it's Entomb. You guys might remember the card Entomb for Priest that you cast on a minion and you shuffled it into your own deck. So if your opponent played Tyrian Forge Ring, you could entomb it. It would remove the Tyrian, the Death Rattle would not activate, and you'd add that Tyrian to your deck to draw later. Gravitron would essentially do the exact same thing, and it would do it up to 3 times for only 1 more mana. That sounds crazy good. But of course, once again, you have to attack the minion. And much like in the previous card we talked about, sometimes that can be a big problem. Having to attack into the Tyrian means you're going to take 6 damage. And if you want to remove something that doesn't have taunt, and your opponent taunts something else in the way, guess what? You're not going to, be able to snipe that, let's say, Alexstrasza hiding behind a Scarab. You're going to have to hit the Scarab, and Alexstrasza is going to hit you for 8. So, once again, neat card that has some limitations. It has some things that keep it from snowballing into totally crazy effects. But sometimes when everything lines up, if the situations are right, this thing has some ridiculous raw value that's perfect for a control warrior. The interesting thing comparing to this to cards like Gorehowl, for instance, or Super Collider, 2 of the historically strong control warrior removal cards of old, is that this one's not nearly as good at dealing with wider boards. Like Super Collider can kill multiple minions effectively. That's nice for Super Collider. Hitting those 2 Mountain Giants together can be a very nice asset. Gravitron would only deal with 1 at a time, so it's much more value or anti-fatigue oriented because it's increasing the depth of your deck as opposed to more tempo oriented. And then Gorehowl, of course, can remove up to 7 things essentially, where Gravitron's really only going to remove 3. Gorehowl has some limits, of course, is only a 7 attack weapon. It can't kill 8/8s. Sorry about that. But nonetheless, it can go a lot longer than something like Gravitron can as well. Not to mention, Gorehowl can also sometimes just hit the opponent's face for 7 damage, and that can be surprisingly good with a card like Gorehowl. So I don't really think this one seems too crazy overpowered compared to other options available to Warrior. It just operates in a new direction and does something that would suit a slow, greedy, fatigue, dead man's hand style warrior pretty nicely. So I love the fantasy too, reaching out and grabbing a minion and pulling it into your deck. The card artwork here and the name fit that perfectly, and it's probably a bit of a Boomsday Project theme as well. So all around, not only a great mechanic, but a good theme and design too. So Gravitron looks really good to me. After that, we have Felo'Melorn, the weapon from Kael'thas in World of Warcraft, one of the more famous weapons in World of Warcraft lore. And this one comes from Deoxys Dominator. It would be a 9 mana 5/3 for Mage. And the effect reads, whenever your hero attacks, deal 2 damage to all enemies. And I think this is just, not particularly complex or crazy design, mechanically speaking, but perfectly fitting for what Mage likes. And it works in a couple directions because it could be good in an aggressive Mage because it's got 15 attack bundled in, but also, it's doing 2 damage, so it's really more like 21 attack because it's 15 from the weapon and then an additional 6 over 3 attacks from the card effect as well. That's 21 damage this could do to an opposing hero. Also, it's just good at resolving little boards and chipping through stuff. You can hit a 7 health minion, so it's kind of like a swipe sometimes, like a 5 damage or a spell damage swipe almost, like deal 5 to one thing, or actually be deal 7 to one thing and deal 2 to everything else. That could be a really good board swing opportunity. But the question for Felo'Melorn is, when do you play this, right? It's a 9 mana card. That's coming really late in the game. It's not always going to line up beautifully. If your opponent has a bunch of 3 health stuff out there, Felo'Melorn's going to look fairly awkward. So does a, Burn Mage run this as another finishing option? Instead of something like Pyroblast, would they just run Felo'Melorn to break their LNF and give them some really crazy late game outs? Possibly. Would a Control Mage run this even? Because of that 2 damage AoE, repeatable over turns. Remember, the cool thing about a card like this is might not be great on that turn 9 when you're only, you're spending 9 mana and you're only getting that 5 damage or that 2 damage AoE. Like, that's not bad. It's not as good as, like, say, a Primordial Drake for 8 mana doing the same sort of thing, but it's okay. But it's those next 2 turns when you didn't have to spend the mana and you still get that 5 damage and you still get that 2 damage AoE. That's when Felo'Melorn starts to look really, really good. It's that second and third turn. So remember, you're really only spending about 3 mana on each of these effects. That's pretty strong if it lasts that long. Of course, weapon removal, outstanding. But I don't know. I think it's just cool because it can be run for both. It's good, maybe aggressively as a finisher, good in control decks. It's got a neat, like, long tail or long-term sort of upside, or gets better the longer it's been equipped, which is cool for mage, and just fitting as a great Warcraft lore weapon that's ideal for the class. Good artwork choice, great name, of course. So all around, to me, just feels like something that could realistically be a Hearthstone card. And then finally here, one last card from Empty Head. This is the Vanguard, a 3-mana 0/3 for warrior. And then calling this a weapons, it's really more of a shield in a way. Of course, it's a weapon in the terms of Hearthstone, but it seems like it's really a shield, because the battle cry here on the Vanguard reads, gain 5 armor and your hero has taunt. Now, I think we need to clarify that your hero has taunt part is probably not a part of the battle cry here. If it were, that would indicate that your hero has taunt for the rest of the game, which I don't think would be the best expression of this effect. I think what it means really in my mind is that as long as this weapon is equipped, then your hero has taunt. So not only would you gain 5 armor, that's the battle cry part, but beyond that, just while this thing's equipped, your hero has taunt. And that's a really neat idea that's been played with a little bit, even actually right now in the Tavern Brawl, of course. One of the heroes you play, your hero has taunt and your minions can't actually be attacked. Vanguard would take that same effect and it would put it into play in the actual game. And for Warrior, that could be a nightmare or a dream come true, because sometimes, you have 100 health and you want to stabilize a board of minions, and you want just to take all the damage because you don't care anyway, and you want to stick stuff and make it hard for your opponent to deal with it. Now, of course, spells could still resolve your minions. Removal spells would work in particular, big board clears and stuff. But if the game is resolving in minion trading, say for instance you're a warrior and you're playing against Deathstalker Rexar Hunter who just keeps making zombies and trading into your board, and he just keeps taking value trades with rushing minions, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm never getting anywhere. He's just gonna bleed me out. I have 100 health. If only I could stabilize 4 or 5 minions on board and create some pressure to win this game. A card like Vanguard would allow you to do that. It'd force all the action through your hero. You'd of course lose some armor, but who cares, because you're sticking 3, 4, 5 minions at a time, and then suddenly you can start to flip a game in your favor. Now, of course, weapon removal means that your opponent does have a way to deal with this, so if it ever became oppressive in the meta, and like warriors just got millions of points of health and nobody could deal with them, running a couple weapon removal options would resolve that very, very quickly. So there is a big risk to running this. If it gets removed immediately, you're probably not all that happy. You only got 5 armor for 3 mana, which at the end of the day is much worse than something like a shield block. It's just not very good. So I like the idea of this, building a deck around this. You can run 2 of them too. This is not a legendary, so if you did, design your deck to operate with this card in mind, you might have a couple ways to do it, or a couple tries added at the very least. And I think it creates a neat playstyle for Warrior. It's something that we know Blizzard can code into the game. It exists right now. It was really fun to play that in the Tavern Brawl as well, and it seemed very powerful too. So I'm curious what this would look like. You could even play this on turn 3. Think about that too. It's not just necessarily a late game card, even if you just have 30 health, but you want to swing the game on turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, playing some really strong minions. And if your opponent just keeps having to attack your face, if you think you can live for 3 or 4 turns, a card like this means you're going to build a big scary board that they probably can't deal with, or something like a zoo deck, for instance, or a minion-based deck of any sort. So to me, I think this would be a really neat card to see in the game. Maybe there's some way to break this, or maybe it's overpowered somehow. I'm not totally sure. But nonetheless, I think those problems can be solved. And this is just so fitting for the fantasy of Warrior. It's cool to see Varian Wryn in the artwork. So all around, I like this design. And there you have it, guys. Finally, custom card review number 6 is done. Some of you thought it was never coming, but it's here. And that said, of course, I want to hear what you guys think about these cards. Please, it's fine to talk about balance. I don't mind. If we miss some crazy thing, if there's some ridiculous overpowered combo, I don't think there is. But if there was, remember, I'm talking about these mostly from a artwork, from a name, from a fantasy, from a flavor standpoint. That's what I look at most with these cards. If there's something that's obviously overpowered to me, I typically exclude it. But for the most part, I'm just thinking about like what would be a good thing to get you started when you're talking about a cool kind of weapon design. Somebody else down the road can make it balanced and fix all the problems with it. That's Chalky's job. Our job is just coming up with neat ideas. Now that said, speaking of neat designs and neat ideas, let's talk about custom card review number 7. You can find the details for submitting your custom card for number 7 in the description and in the comments below. check that out. The rule is going to be the card has to have card text that is 8 words or less. So, for instance, Flame Imp, Battle Cry, deal 3 damage to your hero. That's 7 words. That would be fine. Numbers like the number 3 count as a word. Basically, anything that exists between 2 spaces is 1 word. So if it said +1/+1, that would be a single word because there's no space in between any of those characters. So, you know, basically it's the spaces in between that define how many words. Keywords like Battle Cry and Taunt count as words. The name of the card does not count as a word. Beyond that, you can't cheat and say something like, add a banana to your hand. That's less than 8 words. And then you show the banana card, and the banana card says like, oh, your hero has 47 health, and it can't be attacked and can't be targeted. Obviously, that's way more. All of the different cards and tokens in your submission have to have a total of less than 8 words, 8 words or less. It can't have 8 or less words on them in total. So you can have 3 and 3 if you want. That's possible. You can have 4 and 4, but you can't have 4 and 27 on the token card that's generated by your primary card. So 8 words or less, and it can be anything. It can be a weapon, it could be a minion. That doesn't matter. The idea here is to find a nice, elegant, simple card design that still, still has flavor. It still is exciting. It's unique. It's cool, and that's very hard to do. So I think it's going to be neat to see what you guys figure out here and what you make. I'm excited about this one because most people submit very crazy complex cards with a million words, guys, and that's just not how Hearthstone cards work. This isn't Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering, I think, does that stuff. I see cards where it looks like somebody wrote a novel. That's not Hearthstone. We need to keep things more simple and smooth. So 8 words or less. And again, submission details are below. Trust everything you see in the submission details in case I got anything wrong here. And that said, guys, thank you so very much for your time. So hopefully not going to take so long to get to the next custom card review, but this one was a lot of fun. So thanks for your submissions. Again, don't be mad if you didn't get picked. There are so many great cards. There's like 50 cards I want to pick every single time. And it's really hard to narrow down the list to the final 10. So forgive me if you didn't make the cut. Keep trying. You might get there one day. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.